pray. Lord Jesus Christ, you have become wisdom for us. We thank you that by your Holy Spirit, you will give us the grace to understand the blessings of liberal arts education and the means of producing a liberal arts education, providing a liberal arts education, and most importantly, grounding our students in that knowledge that they need to grow in faith, both now and to eternity. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Okay, friends, I'm Dr. Jim Tallmon. I've taught here many years now, and I'm excited to do this. This is a workbook, more or less, and some resources for you. I'm going to be doing 2 sessions. One is about wisdom and eloquence. It's the relationship of rhetoric and dialectic. And then the other one is how to teach dialectic practically. Instead of just teaching students how to reason logically in an abstract way, how to actually cultivate good judgment and practical wisdom. There you go. Okay, now, so I have both sections covered in this, just so you know. Oh, you didn't get one? I'm sorry. Okay, that's it. I'm out of handouts. I asked Rosalie if she could copy those for me, and I didn't want to ask her to make 25 copies and then have 10 people in the class. So, how many people have been in one of my sessions in the past? Okay, so for the 3 of you in particular, is there anything new you're hoping to learn by coming around one more time? Is there something I can focus on? I'm going to open up my sticky notes now, and I'm going to make a note to self to be sure and focus on this for your benefit, because I don't want it to be just repetitive, because I will be covering foundational issues for people. I really try to hit on the foundational issues as much as possible, but I don't want to bore you to tears. I want to also meet your needs. So,
The crossing
Alicia.
over, to be able to, do the dialectic at the same time with the subject contents.
I love that. I tell my students, okay, today we're going to learn how to do the dialectic. Come on, baby, do the dialectic. Only you're not supposed to dance at Patrick Henry College, so I can't move my feet too much when I do that. No, I mock them. Okay, how to integrate doing the dialectic with doing rhetoric.
Right.
With being persuasive.
Right.
Richard Weaver, all the way. Richard Weaver has the most penetrating insights about the relationship of dialectic to rhetoric of anybody in the history of rhetorical theory. And what he has to say about the cultural role of rhetoric really gets to the interplay of being a searcher after truth, and he talks about the pure dialectician. In the essay entitled The Cultural Role of Rhetoric, Richard Weaver uses the trial of Socrates to illustrate what happens when you're too much of a dialectician. And you're so concerned about abstract truth that you really don't have that much concern about your neighbor.
Right.
Right? And so the interplay between the abstract search for truth and the practical loving of one's neighbor and trying to move your neighbor toward the good is I think, the best opportunity to really take a philosophical approach to that question.
Okay.
Okay, Jim.
On the 5 resources you have for Weaver, is there an order that would be good to follow in collecting his works and reading them in a certain order to gain a better understanding of how he teaches the topic?
Oh, I can just answer that right now.
Okay.
What is maybe the first?
The place you should begin reading Richard Weaver is Ideas Have Consequences, because that's the seminal work of Weaver in conservative philosophy, conservative American philosophy. Okay? And in particular, I think, as you're a pastor, right?
Yep.
As a pastor, you'll really enjoy the chapter entitled The Power of the Word. But that's the first book of Richard Weaver's you should read. And then in terms of rhetoric and dialectic, you should read Languages Sermonic. Then you should read Life Without Prejudice and other essays. Weaver is an apologist for prejudice, rightly understood. In other words, you have to have some sort of discriminations in life, or valuation makes no sense.
Mm-hmm.
So he's playing around with the idea. And then my favorite of Weaver's an essayist, and so all of his books are collections of essays, except The Ethics of Rhetoric. The Ethics of Rhetoric is a scholarly book. And it's best for academic types. But Visions of Order is my favorite book by Richard Weaver, and you can get that from the Intercollegiate Studies Institute for $12.95. And they reprinted it. Visions of Order, the cultural crisis of our time. It's so prophetic. It's so insightful about culture and what happens when a culture unravels, and how you get it back, how you operate as a doctor of culture. And so I'm at a place where the mission is to influence the culture for Christ and for liberty. So that book, Visions of Order, is right up my alley. I really appreciate it a lot. And he does a critique in the very last chapter. It would have been the very last essay published of Richard Weaver. This was published posthumously. He died at 53. And Reconsideration of Man is the last essay, or the last collection of essays published posthumously. Reconsideration of Man, he does a critique of evolutionary philosophy. It's just really, really solid.
Dr. Tallmon?
Yes, ma'am.
So it's called Visions of Order. Is his premise that the cultural crisis is disorder?
Chaotic. Yeah. That the disillusion of the West is leading to chaos, which leads to psychoses. And to reintroduce harmony. What did Dr. Korchak say about, he was talking about Luther's critique of the humanists, that they were, that their position tended to detract from the value of harmony in society, or take away from the ability to have the harmony and the unity provided by the liberal arts.
Right.
Something like that. So Weaver's observations about cultural well-being are really good. So then, did I have the Ethics of Rhetoric in there?
Yeah,
Yes.
The last one would be a rhetoric handbook. How would that play in?
Oh, well, the Rhetoric and Handbook is, I have a thing called the Rhetoric Ring. That is what I use quite extensively to teach my students rhetoric, and I've made large sections of that available to classical educators to use as well. There's a logic tutorial on there that's taken right out of Weaver's Handbook in Rhetoric, Chapter 5 on argumentation. So it's really valuable. So I would say that has significant utility in a number of ways.
And I'm sorry, what was the name?
Someone who's just trying to, appreciate we vary in thought and that sort of thing, you wouldn't relate to that way. It's a textbook. And it's really hard to find. I actually had a buddy in my master's program spotted it at a bookstore in Denver and grabbed it off. That's how we did that.
The rhetoric handbook.
Rhetoric and Handbook. Weaver taught at the University of Chicago in the 50s and until 1963, and he was a composition professor, and he wrote this. It's an Aristotelian composition textbook, and it's a rhetoric, and the handbook is like a writing, like Strunken ones or something. And he also wrote an excellent essay that's not in any of those works called, oh yes it is, excuse me, it's in Languages Sermonic. There's an essay called To Write the Truth. To Write the Truth. Remember the old television program, To Tell the Truth?
Yes.
He was playing on that idea, and he identified 3 approaches to teaching people to write. Teaching them the mechanics of writing, utiliter loqui, teaching them, I can't remember the middle category, but anyway, there's a middle category, and then there's very loqui, teaching them to write the truth, and how that elevates the enterprise of teaching. It's really a fine essay. Okay, and I forgot your name, I'm sorry, in the back.
Heather.
Heather. Do you have a particular thing you'd like to take away from this session?
No, I think it was in one of your more general addresses before, so
Okay,
I'm,
then a little review wouldn't hurt. Okay, let's get started. Well, before we get started, did any of the discussion thus far, or my ambush of Dr. Korchak at the session earlier prompt anything you'd like to talk about or question
I
or
have
clarification?
something.
Yes, Cheryl.
When someone asked Dr. Korchak, could you have a trivium without grammar, logic, and rhetoric? He said yes. But could you have a Lutheran trivium without grammar, logic, and rhetoric? Because rhetoric...
Take Dr. Hine out and ask him that question over dinner.
Faith comes by hearing, hearing from the word of Christ. If we don't preach...
And the trivium develops in the student the habits of mind that give us ears to hear. So I think by definition, and the education that Luther prescribed would hold that those trivium are irreplaceable with 3. I could buy the idea of having others. That's, that sort of flexibility makes sense, but I think that there's a matter of identification and definition involved in those 3 particular liberal arts. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think that was my point. And I was the one who asked the question.
Yeah.
And, how fluid is it? Well, is it so fluid we can remove what I think we'd all identify as core aspects of it?
They're foundational
Right.
in cultivating habits of mind.
I can't conceive of the logic without grammars.
Yeah.
But we'll see how it develops.
Yeah.
Rhetoric without logic.
But I'll confess right up front, I'm a purist, and I've never liked eclectics. Just eclecticism doesn't appeal to me. So that makes sense that I would respond to what you said that way. Does anyone want to offer an alternative? Point? Yeah, I don't think you can compromise those 3 arts away and the truth. But you shouldn't be so rigid, I guess.
But wasn't his more to the matter of the student being able to take those, not should he, but say the finances or circumstances did not allow? I don't think he was saying that it wasn't important, but just that it would
It's
not.
ideal.
Right.
Yeah. Maybe that was his point.
That's what I got.
And as an educator, I have really mellowed over the years in terms of my commitment that everyone should be educated this way. Because I've bumped into people that I think could reach their full potential and be happy in a fundamental sense, working at functional level. There are people that aren't really suited for classical liberal arts studies. And I used to just be adamant that this is education for everyone.
Right.
I'm still adamant.
Yeah.
Is there maybe a level that you can take it for every student? And then I had thought I had heard in the Reformation, they started making distinction between those students who are more academic and go into professional occupations and those who would be more vocational or craftsmen, artisans.
Yeah, and then that's gotten very staid in the German system. They do, testing and they determine tracks at a very early age, and I think that's very limiting. So you could take that to an extreme really quickly. But to me, Catherine, it's analogous to saying we're a many-membered body, right? Some members have noble purposes by other member standards, but they're still quite important. And so I don't think every member has to be an intellectual. But how you determine that for an individual, and that can feel like giving up on somebody, if you make that determination too quickly, like this really isn't the thing. I have a daughter who wants to go to massage therapy school. She is not academically inclined. She doesn't like to read. And she would really enjoy serving people in that way, with sports injuries and that sort of thing. And I gave her the best liberal arts experience I could, but she's just a jock. She loves sports, and she's homeschooling for her was really, really an ugly chore. We gave up on it in her case. She just fought it tooth and nail. So there you go. That's my stark confession. All right, speaking of Richard Weaver. Richard Weaver, I was thinking of this when Dr. Korchak was speaking at some point. I can't remember what it was, but he said, in the restored man, dialectic and rhetoric will go along hand in hand as the regime of the human faculties intended that they should do. That's at the very close of Language's sermonic. Wisdom and eloquence. Dialectic represents cultivating arts of wisdom, and rhetoric, arts of eloquence. Aristotle, in his treatise on rhetoric, says, now rhetoric is a counterpart or antistrophos of dialectic. And later, he relates rhetoric to ethics. So, is there a whiteboard under here? No.
Right there.
Oh, okay. No pens. Here they are. Good. That's okay. I'm not going to do this a whole lot. But I had a really great illustration given to me once. According to Aristotle, rhetoric is a counterpart of both dialectic and ethics, but for different reasons. And the word antistrophos is an interesting word. I asked a linguist one time what that means, and he thought for just a very brief moment, and then he grabbed a pen and went to the whiteboard and he said, have you ever been pulling weeds, and you have two plants growing up side by side, and they look very similar, but they look like different plants, but you pull one, and you find out that the roots are joined together. They share a common root. That's what an antistrophos is. they look distinct, but they share a common root. They're parallel, in the case of rhetoric and dialectic, they're parallel faculties, but they share a common root. And they're parallel for a couple of reasons. Number one is they have no subject matter of their own. Dialectic and rhetoric are similar because they have no subject matter of their own. Dialectic is a faculty or a power that is used to test for truth of propositions of a contingent nature. Contingent meaning they're debatable. Okay? Demonstrative reasoning is different from dialectical reasoning insofar as demonstrative deals, and analytic reasoning deals with that which is true in the positive sense. It's positively true. This is the positive contingent dichotomy. Okay? 2 + 2 = 4. Really? Yes, absolutely. We ought to take that baby off life support. Really? Is that true? Well, here's why, in my opinion, we should do that. Oh, okay. Well, then we can just flip a coin, right?
Right.
No. There is truth that's based on opinion and probability that matters. That's the realm of the contingent. What is the right thing to do where the right thing is debatable? Okay, so dialectic and rhetoric operate in the contingent realm. Dialectic is a test for truth of propositions of a contingent nature, and it can be used in all different kinds of areas: ethics, law, and so forth. Okay? Rhetoric is also an art of arguing about a variety of things, trying to persuade people about the truth that dialectic secures in matters of opinion. Aristotle says it's the same mistake for a mathematician to use only probable proofs as it would be for an ethicist to use only mathematical proofs. So the domain is the contingent. They're alike in that fashion. They operate in the same domain. And they're faculties that are useful in a variety of fields. Wisdom and eloquence. Later in his treatise on rhetoric, Aristotle relates rhetoric to ethics. He said it's also a counterpart of ethics, but it's not the same. It doesn't have an antistrophic relationship like it does. Essentially what he means is, in order to persuade people, you have to know to what are you persuading them, toward what. And ethically speaking, for other than the sophists, for the ancients, rhetoric was an art of moving the soul toward the good. Okay, so you need to understand what is the good and also what is good for the particular audience and how do you move them toward it. So you have to understand a little bit about what makes people tick. And rightly relating to one another is part of rhetoric as well. And so, for Aristotle, rhetoric is also closely associated with ethics and psychology. Okay. So there are implications there regarding truth, beauty, and goodness. This is what I'm going to speak on in Fort Wayne in October at Dr. Nordman's conference. I'm going to elaborate on truth, beauty, and goodness, first in the small catechism, and then just generally in one's understanding of the relationship between dialectic, the search for truth, beauty, and goodness. Dialectic, rhetoric, and ethics. Yes, sir?
You said moving the soul toward the good. Did they have an understanding, as we would today as Lutherans, between the soul and the flesh? I mean, is there, because
Well, they
persuading
had
one
the
or other-
Epicurean kind of view of that, I would say, but we can appropriate that view of, in fact, in the Renaissance, that was a big topic of inquiry and research was, what are the faculties of the soul? And how do we understand the soul in light of Christian doctrine? And what are the elements that constitute the soul? Faculty psychology. That's actually an extension of a proposition Plato made in a work called the Phaedrus, that rhetoric could be redeemed if it began with a study of the soul. That kind of gave birth to psychology, as we know today. But it began with an interest in how do we move people toward the good. And then, of course, the good is open to debate as well. That's a matter of dialectical discussion. What is the good? And then you have the universal good versus the particular good. Okay, well, anyway, the way I approach this is very simple. When I'm teaching my students, and actually, I want you to really walk away from here with this understanding. I'm a college professor, but my online class should be taken by 10th graders. Because in the medieval curriculum, when did they start their rhetorical education? According to Dorothy Sayers. 8th grade. Okay, so they were prepared throughout the earlier grades for rhetorical education, but by the time they were about what we would consider 8th grade today, they were ready for rhetorical education, and when they completed that phase, then they went on to university. So ideally, what I'm teaching college freshmen should be taught to sophomores in high school. And can be very easily. And is where people are being classically educated and they have a good tutor. A lot of kids are mastering rhetoric much earlier than college. So I teach my rhetoric class, which I'm going to propose when I get back to Patrick Henry College. I'm glad Dr. Heath isn't in the room because I don't want to spring it out quite yet. But I think they were trying to establish some distinctiveness in their curriculum by having logic and rhetoric offered, but I don't think it serves our students all that well to have it called rhetoric, because really what I'm teaching them is fundamentals of public speaking from a really strong classical rhetorical point of view. I start with Dorothy L. Sayers, and we discuss the lost tools of learning and the place of rhetoric in the trivium and what is liberal arts education and all of that stuff. But I begin with a foundational exposure to the arts of eloquence from a rhetorical point of view, and it's really practical. It is a public speaking class with stair-stepped exercises that help them apply lessons learned. Okay? Because I don't think they need necessarily to jump in and start studying Quintilian, Cicero, Aristotle, and Socrates. That's if it were a class in rhetorical theory, that would make sense. But I think theory should follow practice. They need to, first of all, learn what they do intuitively and then reflect on their intuitive practices, and then learn more about the theory of why it's done that way. Okay? So I start with fundamentals of public speaking, and then there are two classes that follow. argumentation and debate, left brain, advanced public speaking, right brain. Cultivating wisdom and practical reasoning in particular, and on the other hand, cultivating style and imagination. You put that all together and you have a very well-rounded, articulate young person. So what I want to do is really, in the most practical way right now for the rest of the time we have, I just want to explain to you how I teach argumentation and debate and advanced public speaking. But in my next session, I'm just going to touch on argumentation and debate now, because I'm going to explicate that much more fully in my next session. If you're interested, then we can talk about that class then. Okay? All right. Questions or comments before we proceed?
Dr. Tallmon,
Yes, sir.
can you say that again about the theory and practice stuff? You said that we should reflect upon our practice
Yes.
and then understand the theory behind.
Consciously reflect on why you do what you do intuitively, because everybody speaks and reasons and persuades and thinks critically, you know. Kids are inquisitive and they don't generally just believe whatever you tell them. So,
So you use that kind of as a starting point. Obviously, there's probably some things that they're not doing. Is that true?
yes, and so you give them opportunity, you give them some theory, then discuss nuts and bolts, give them an opportunity to practice what they've learned, and then you reflect on that, you debrief, and then you have more theory, and it's stair-stepped. And I think that's a liberal arts approach, actually. But what a lot of people try to do with young people is jam their heads full of rhetorical theory. There's 2,500 years of rhetorical theory out there. It's been a big topic of discussion for a long, long time. And a lot of them get overwhelmed with the theory, and that doesn't make them any more articulate than studying Mozart makes you, right? Now you need to study Mozart to be an artiste on the piano. You need to understand theory and everything, but you don't read and read and read theory without practicing a lot when you're first attempting to master the instrument. So I think it's a mistake to jump right in and have them read volumes of theory, and so does Luther. As I was reading those excerpts from Lutheran education at CCLE.org, one thing that really jumped out at me is, I found it very affirming, because I'm a very instinctual person when it comes to classical liberal arts learning. I'm learning just like everybody as we go over the last 10 years. You know, I read Dorothy L. Sayers in 1985 or something like that, and I was really impressed with it. And so I thought, okay, rhetoric is really important in the classical liberal arts. I realize that now, having read that, so I want to make it appear so. And I started reading more in graduate school about, you know, what Quintilian did and different rhetorical pedagogues over the years, over the ages. But I'm almost kind of self-taught in some ways. So it was really affirming to me to just recently read Luther and what he said about making it child's play. And in other words, don't suck all the joy out of learning. And the other thing that really I found affirming was that it doesn't really, and I think he was reacting to the scholastics a lot when he said it doesn't do your students any good to jam their heads full of these highfalutin books. It might make the professor feel important and give them something to brag about, but it doesn't necessarily help the student. So, and the reason that was affirming to me is when I went to Patrick Henry College, for example, I think a lot of people were afraid I might be dumbing down the rhetoric course. This is a sidebar, I apologize. I'll get right back on task. It's Steve's fault. When I first went to Patrick Henry College, there were some old guard students who were really concerned about us dumbing down their precious curriculum. Because when they started there, it was way up here, God's Harvard, when they aspired to be that. The only problem is that wasn't too sustainable because for a variety of reasons. But when I came in there, I really wanted to make the rhetoric class a true core course for 17 and 18-year-old kids. Not a graduate level rhetorical theory class so that they can claim this is God's Harvard, which was not age appropriate. So I insist, and I got my argument down pretty well, so that's why I thought I'd rehash it for you, just so you can hear how someone in that position had to deal with that kind of skepticism about what you're doing. I maintain that taking that measured approach that's age appropriate and focuses on praxis rather than mastery of content of theory, of 2,500 years of theory. And also, what I said is, okay, I'm a rhetorician. I've been brought here to establish a track within the classical liberal arts major where people who are interested in studying rhetoric further can follow up with classes on rhetorical theory and classes on rhetorical criticism and so forth. So we don't have to throw everything but the kitchen sink into this one core course. That's part of the problem from before. They had everything in there you could imagine. And they were trying to do everything in that one course. So I limited it. I stripped it down a little bit. I did what I thought was consistent with Dorothy L. Sayers on cultivating arts of eloquence as opposed to mastering the subject of rhetoric. So hopefully that, if you're teaching it, that'll help you articulate what you want to do and why. Or if you're reading lots of rhetorical theory with 8th graders, maybe hopefully it'll make you second guess whether or not that's what you want to be doing. Okay, well, let's start with argumentation debate. I have lots of materials at the rhetoric ring about the fundamentals of public speaking class, the rhetoric class it's called on the Patrick Henry College site. And I think there are places in this primer where I have the rhetoric ring URL listed. Yeah, it's right down under syllogistic logic. If you do http www.phc.edu/rr_rhetoric_php, it should go to the rhetoric home. Instead of guessing, I'm going to go there now. Yeah, it's rr_rhetoric_home, one word, .php, okay? All right, so we're not going to talk about the rhetoric class. We're going to talk about argumentation, debate, and advanced public speaking. I start with a unit called Boot Camp of the Mind. They have a logic class, so I take their logic, the essentials of practical logic, and condense that into a 4-week session. And it's by way of review, and it's to show them the the difference between making abstracted arguments and what I call street logic. More the kind of logic you use in practical argumentation when you're trying to move people about something that matters in the real world, as opposed to symbolic logic, which is it serves the same function as grammar does. It helps you discipline your mind, it teaches you structures and that sort of thing. Symbolic logic has its place, but applied logic is for actually moving people, winning hearts and minds. Okay, so then I define practical reasoning for them. You can read that for yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
I elaborate on each of those and talk about how valuable it is to cultivate the intellectual ability to make appropriate distinctions and to spot faulty logic and contradictions. And then I say there are 3 tools that you're going to learn that will, as far as I understand, are the basic tools that were imparted in a classical liberal arts education according to the way Dorothy Sayers explicates it. And these are basic tools like a saw, a hammer, and a pair of pliers. They're syllogistic logic, dialectic, and common material fallacies. And I tie them to that definition for practical reasoning. Syllogistic logic is where you begin because it teaches you to follow an argument to its logical conclusion, and it helps you identify assumptions. If you understand the rules for a valid syllogism, and part of the argument is left unstated, you can use your knowledge of a valid syllogism to reconstruct the missing part. All right. But identifying assumptions and evaluating them are 2 different matters. Not in practice. In practice, to see an assumption is to evaluate it. It happens instantaneously in the mind, right? But for purposes of pedagogy, I explain to the students, you have to separate out the ability to identify an assumption and study that, and then to evaluate the assumptions. What are the tools that you use to evaluate assumptions? Dialectic and common material fallacies are tests for truth. We'll talk about those later. In the meantime, there are 2 linked assignments. I have initial assignments that just help them get the jitters out and allow them to work on their basic organizational skills. In argumentation and debate, they actually do a philosophical speech. Here's a nice aside. In the argumentation and debate class, I actually give them a certificate of completing the boot camp of the mind. And their ceremony, at which I give them the certificate, is a round of speeches that are philosophical. I tell them I want them to do a kind of a reflective, contemplative speech about a philosophical question that you find intriguing. Okay? And I want you to take a stand on this concept, whether you agree with it or disagree with it, in part or in whole, and why. So you have to make an argument that's philosophical in nature based on this. They go to the great books of the Western world. You know that set, right? The Encyclopedia Britannica, Great Books of the Western World. The first volume is called The Great Conversation. Interesting reading. I commend it to you. You should read The Great Conversation. It's an essay by Mortimer Adler about liberal arts education. It's splendid. The second and third volumes are called the Syntopicon. It's a synthesis of the topics that constitute the great conversation. Those ideas that have intrigued great thinkers since the beginning of recorded time and will probably engage them into eternity, at which time knowledge will be. But, so you have angel, constitution, imagination is one of them, I think, reason, all the way through the end of the alphabet. So you have, in the Syntopicon, you have all these topics. There's an introductory essay on the idea, according to great thinkers. And then there's an outline where it breaks it down into its various subtopics. And then, annotated to that outline, they have a section where you can find in the great books, on the exact quadrant on the page in the volume of the great books, what Augustine wrote about this topic, or Shakespeare, or whatever. Love, the love of a man for a woman, and why it's a beautiful thing. And it'll tell you to go to volume 18, page 362, quadrant A. And you'll find a passage on that particular little subtopic within the outline. It's brilliantly useful. And so I tell them I want them to use it in that fashion, and then skim until they find an idea that really intrigues them, and then run with it. Okay, so that was that aside. That's their graduation from boot camp of the mind, and they make a philosophical argument, and I use that as a foil for guess what? The kind of arguments you make for the whole rest of the semester, which pertain to actual questions about policy matters or prudential conduct or something like that. Questions that impinge on actuality. Okay, so in that vein, after having discussed practical reasoning and syllogistic logic for them, or with them, and then showing them how they can use knowledge of syllogisms to identify assumptions, I challenge them to pick a policy controversy that they would like to research fully, and they have to give 2 speeches about it. With younger kids, you might want to consider breaking it into 3 speeches. I used to do it that way, but Patrick Henry's students got really bored by the time they got to the 3rd speech. So they had the ability to grasp what was happening more quickly than the students I had taught in other institutions. So I condensed it into an analysis of controversy speech and persuasive speech. Ground rules. Number 1, in the analysis of controversy speech, you can't make your position known. You're supposed to analyze both sides of the argument even-handedly. And number 2, I don't just want to hear a speech that says, they say this and they say that, they say this and they say that. Surface arguments, right? They have to identify the underlying assumptions that account for why it is that 2 groups of people can look at identical facts and derive completely opposite conclusions. How can this be? Worldview, presupposition, right? So I'm teaching them how to reason deeply about issues that matter in the real world. And they have to exercise the discipline to not start pounding the pulpit right off the bat. Don't get to do that. Okay, so the assignment is out there. We discussed syllogistic logic. I have a little logic tutorial that I put together for them. And then they have to apply it in that speech on a controversial policy topic that they research. And they do the equivalent in those 2 speeches of a research paper about that amount of research. Okay. They use syllogistic logic and knowledge of enthymemes. An enthymeme is a syllogism that's missing a proposition. And I make this argument with them. People don't go around speaking in syllogisms. You don't go into a wedding reception and somebody taps on their glass and says, "Ladies and gentlemen, please do not steal the silverware." Some things can just be taken for granted, right? You don't have to state all your premises all the time. And the people you research when you're preparing for your controversial policy speech aren't going to be stating all their premises either. So you have to learn, as Richard Weaver says in his Rhetoric and Handbook, It is of great value to gain some facility in rebuilding an enthymeme into a complete syllogism, so you can determine whether or not the conclusion follows from the premises according to the rules of syllogism and so forth. In other words, you get the whole picture before you start critiquing. So I introduce them to that, and then they do this speech to demonstrate mastery of identifying assumptions and doing some research and trying to be articulate about something that's fairly complex in a short amount of time, which is a lesson I could learn myself right now. Now, art versus intuition. Was anybody looking at that and wondering, what does it do with that? How does that fit in? I confess to my students, I'm not curious about that at all. I confess to my students, you don't learn anything in my class that you don't do already. But then I draw a distinction between how you operate intellectually on an intuitive level versus mastering arts of wisdom and eloquence. That you have to consciously reflect on things that you do in a very subconscious way in some cases. And then I teach, would anyone be interested in hearing how I teach that, or should I skip it? I have a way of teaching art versus intuition. It's Aristotelian.
Okay.
It's based on Aristotle. Thumbnail sketch. First of all, you have to define it. As I've studied Aristotle, I've decided that his MO is the following. Any body of knowledge that Aristotle is trying to discuss intelligibly with his students, he first of all defines it, and then he breaks it into parts, which makes sense if it's a complex body of knowledge. Why? You can answer that in your own. Right? So then once you break it into parts, you study the parts. And for Aristotle, his approach is based on these questions. How is this part like that part? Genera. How is this part like that part? And then the question that follows would be what, Steve? How are they differentiated one from another? Differentiate. Genera, differentiate. That's the basis of what? Think biology. Kingdom, what?
Taxonomy.
Yes, yes. Genera and differentia are the basis of classification. So you see that at play in Aristotle's approach to any body of knowledge that he's attempting to help students master as an art. And then beyond, and then ultimately you have to understand how the parts all work together, integration. How are the parts, how do they work together? And then there's no substitute for theory. I try to get them to understand. And this is an important point in classical learning. If you're attempting to master a body of knowledge as an art, there's no substitute for theory. As Joseph Dunn says in his definition of techne, which is the Greek word for art, it is the ability to give a rational account of not only the how and the what, but the why and the wherefore of the making process. Techne is craft knowledge. The rational account of not only the how and the what, but the why and the wherefore of the making process that gives the expert maker the ability to preside over his art with secure mastery. I just love that image of presiding with secure mastery. So that's why there's no substitute for theory when you're attempting to master a body of knowledge as an art. And then ultimately, what's the next thing you have to do if you want to master any body of knowledge? Every day. Practice. Practice. Practice until it becomes habituation. The Greek word there is praxis. And you no longer consciously reflect on why you do what you do. You just do it. It comes out your fingers, in through your eyes, out your fingers. Okay, so make it child's play, measured doses. Don't overload people. Allow them to have fun learning. That's a good thing. And give them opportunities to practice what they're learning. All right. I play games like minding the premises. Who's minding the premises? I'll take some clips from Monty Python or Jurassic Park or Napoleon Dynamite, and we'll just set up the VCR and I'll pass the remote and say, when you see an assumption, because Jeff Goldblum, just think about Jurassic Park. What is Jeff Goldblum's shtick? It's rapid fire, fragmented discard. Do you know what So Jeff Goldblum just throws arguments out in this one section of Jurassic Park where they sit down and they have Chilean sea bass dinner together, and they're trying to determine the risks of the park. And he goes, you know, the lack of humility here in the face of this awesome power you're wielding is just staggering. And the lawyer tries to get him to chill out a little bit, you know. And that's an excellent excerpt to use to get people. I tell them, look, you guys, it's one thing to learn logic on a whiteboard. It's another thing to be able to exercise quick wit in the moment, especially when you're dealing with people like Robin Williams or Jeff Goldblum, because they're so rapid fire. But if you can stop, if you can push pause when you see an assumption and then tell me, was that argument fully developed or was it presented enthematically? Was there part, and most of the time with Jeff Goldblum, he's not going to spell out all of his premises. But that's the brilliance of it, because the audience applies a lot of them. So I do games like that to keep it fun. Hopefully that gave you an idea. All right, dialectic I'm going to cover in my next section, so I won't even discuss it here now, but after they're done with the analysis of controversy speech, the next assignment is the persuasive speech. As we ramp up to the persuasive speech, that's where I teach them the fundamentals of Aristotelian dialectic, and I juxtapose it with Hegelian dialectic because they're radically different, which you already know, I'm sure. And then I teach them, actually I don't have to teach them common material fallacies because they studied that in their logic class at Patrick Henry College. But it's interesting to know, most of them studied it so they could take a test on it. But to be able to spot fallacies in the opposing viewpoint when you're trying to refute them in a persuasive context is another animal. So it gives them a way to apply what they were learning, and so I really push that, applying what you learned, as the ramp up to the persuasive speech. Well, okay, so am I done at 4 o'clock? I'm not surprised if I used all my time yet.
4:15.
Yay! We'll have time for questions.
Okay.
Okay, so then after the analysis of controversy and persuasive speeches, then they have a unit on moral argumentation where I teach them casuistry and I teach them how to resolve a moral dilemma in medical ethics. And then we have a mock ethics committee meeting. We have a Jehovah's Witness and blood transfusion case that we analyze that I boil down to a 2-page case brief with 2 paragraphs on Jehovah's Witness doctrine. And they hold a mock ethics committee meeting on it without a grade. That's another important thing that I think is really important when you're trying to cultivate moral or intellectual habits and cultivate abilities, skill sets, rather than mastery of content. You should have a non-graded exercise first and then a graded assignment. I've taken to distinguishing between exercises and assignments on that basis. One's graded and one's not. Because to have the mock ethics committee meeting about the Jehovah's Witness case just gets them really familiar with it, and it gets the juices flowing. Then I give them an assignment prompt and say, okay, now, for a grade, write a 7 to 8 page opinion as an ethics consultant to the medical center in which you analyze the case, identify the crux of the matter, render a judgment, and defend your judgment, hence moral argumentation. Okay? Then they debate, and it's straight up debate. We learn how to do parliamentary debate and policy debate. I have them argue one side. They agree on a proposition that they want to debate. I have them argue one side one day, they flip for sides, and then the next class period they argue the opposite side against each other. So it's that sort of debate. That's the argumentation and debate class. More to come on dialectic next session. Remember I said that the advanced public speaking class cultivates style and imagination. That complements the left brain habits that you cultivate in argumentation and debate. So, well, I guess I should skip this. What do I have on here? Rhetoric, pathos, and style. Aristotle's definition of rhetoric: the faculty of discovering in any given case the available means of persuasion. The available means of persuasion are proofs, according to Aristotle, and there are some proofs that are artistic and some that are inartistic. Inartistic proofs are merely used by the orator, rhetorician, student of rhetoric, rhetor, practitioner of rhetoric. Okay? The inartistic proofs are simply evidence, hard evidence, testimony. You use those, you don't invent them through rules of art, through technique. The artistic proofs are 3 in number: ethos, pathos, and logos, or ethos, ethos, and logos. Okay? Who doesn't know about ethos, pathos, and logos? Raise your hand. Never heard of them. Okay? All right. Good. Here we go. In his treatise on rhetoric, Aristotle defines ethos as possibly the most important of the artistic proofs that the rhetor possesses. This has to do with your persona, the way you present yourself, and how your audience perceives you. Are you credible? Are you a truth teller? Are you a virtuous person? Are you lying to me? Okay? And that presupposes that trust is a vital element in rhetoric. Trust between the speaker and the audience. If I will not invest some trust in you, why would I open myself up to be persuaded by you? Okay? Aristotle also decided that one of the fundamentals of persuasion is logos, or logos, good reasons. I'm not going to be persuaded by you if you don't give me good reasons. So this is the appeal to reason, logic. Now, pathos is what actually makes rhetoric really interesting to me, because this brings us into the realm of the whole person. Rhetoric appeals to man in his whole being in ways that, as Weaver says, only a human being can intuit. So if you want to persuade people, you can't just appeal to their sense of logic unless they're Vulcans, which we're not. We're human beings. We're flesh and blood human beings. And so to win hearts and minds, so I make a strong distinction in my classes for my students in terms of the ethics of rhetoric between making a statement to grab headlines and actually trying to win hearts and minds. That's more gospel-oriented, that aim. Okay? So, pathos is the appeal to emotions and core values. Now, a strict logician will say, well, there shouldn't be any emotional appeals in your argumentation. That just clouds the matter. Right? Well, then why did Jesus speak in parables? And why does Paul use metaphors almost nonstop? The truth can be clarified through the appropriate and thoughtful use of figures of speech. So that's where pathos comes in. Moving, persuasion is about moving the soul in the direction that you wish them to move, not in a manipulative sense, but in the most genuine sense. This is what I believe will be in the best interest of all. We should pursue this course. Okay? So moving the soul toward the good. Pathos is what gives the impulse to the truth that is dialectically secure. That's right out of the Weaver also. Okay, so those are the three modes of artistic proof. Rhetoric appeals to human beings in their fullness. Okay, and Sir Francis Bacon. Once we work that out and we have a couple of assignments, we take it to another level and we revisit style by discussing Sir Francis Bacon's definition of rhetoric. Sir Francis Bacon was a professor of rhetoric, among other things. He taught rhetoric as one of his courses. And he defined it as the application of reason to imagination for the better moving of the will. Now, moderns read that better moving of the will, and they read it as the efficient moving of the will or something like that. But I think what he was implying there is that you want to move people toward the good. Just like when Aristotle defines rhetoric as the faculty of discovering in any given case the available means of persuasion, he's not saying persuading people by any means necessary, but that's how a lot of people read that at first glance. What he's saying is there are available means of persuasion, which presupposes what? What does that imply? If there are available means of persuasion, there must be some means of persuasion that are unavailable to the honest rage worker. Okay, well that all impinges on the ethics of rhetoric, not necessarily advanced public speaking class. Yes, ma'am.
I look at this and maybe I just completely misunderstand the statement. But when I look at this better moving of the will, to me it's somewhere along the line, kind of crudely, like a voluntary agreement between the person who's trying to persuade.
Okay, yeah. As long as it's with respect to the dignity of the audience and their free will, that would probably be in keeping with this. It's not a statement about manipulation or propaganda or something like that. Okay, so then what we do in advanced public speaking class, and I will wrap up in 30 seconds, is we adopt an ancient methodology called imitatio. They learn by memorizing a great speech from days of yore. I have them select 5 minutes of it and commit it to memory. When you memorize something, you have to fuss with each line. It's really a good exercise. And then it's stair-stepped. The next phase is they take the theme, they have to essentialize the speech to the theme, and then they imitate the style of that orator and translate the theme into something contemporary. And then ultimately, guess what? An original oration that's supposed to be inspirational and it's supposed to articulate the style that you wish to ultimately embrace when you grow up. Sir?
Back to the comment on Sir Francis Bacon.
Yes.
I don't know what he means by will, but is there an assumption, talking about trying to discover the assumption, presupposition,
Yes.
that we that the will is good, and so it can be moved in a better way, or
No, I don't know that much about Bacon's theology per se, but I think that what he was trying to underscore, Steve, is that the will is part of the faculty that constitutes, part of the faculties that constitute the soul, and that you need to move the will in the direction that's going to be beneficial to that person or to society as a whole. And so the art of moving that will is what's important. The nature of the will itself, I don't really know what Bacon would say about that.
the second thing I wanted to ask about is what role does writing have in speech giving in your classes and courses?
I'm teaching an online class right now, and they just turned in their second assignment yesterday. They never delivered that as a speech. They learned by composing and then practicing out loud and then revising, and they're supposed to reflect on the revision process. How did it improve, and what did you do that helped it improve? Why did that improve it? So rhetoric is a big, is an important field of study in composition studies as well as in speech communication. So it's all rhetoric. Yes, ma'am.
What are some of your favorite speeches to have memorized?
Well, Henry V and Mark Antony's appeal to the people of Rome, the death of Caesar, and Patrick Henry, yeah, those are both written. Yeah. Patrick Henry's Give Me Liberty is fine. Ronald Reagan's Time for Choosing. Trying to think of some other. Ain't I a Woman by Sojourner Truth is really interesting.
Now, if I Googled Reagan Time for Choosing, would I come up with that speech?
Mm-hmm. Just Google the speech.
Okay.
That's what it's known as. Just go to AmericanRhetoric.com. They have the 100 top speeches of the 20th century. That's a good little resource. And then also at AmericanRhetoric.com, there's a whole library of great speeches. That's a good resource.
And if you see anything by Winston Churchill, it's all good.
Winston Churchill, I was going to say, Winston Churchill's Blood, Sweat, Toil, and Tears. The one he gave to the Canadian Parliament. I'll imitate this for you. Winston Churchill's talking about Hitler and his minions and Mussolini and his flop. And then he says, Hitler, in his arrogance, prophesied that within 6 weeks, England would have her neck wrung like a chicken. Some chicken. Some neck. It's really funny. Yes, sir.
You're probably out of time, but you were talking about rhetoric in terms of oral and written, which represent two great ages. Is there anything about work being done with rhetoric and the visual age?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Yeah.
There are subfields of rhetorical criticism about everything under the sun. There's a really interesting field of study about the rhetoric of memorials, like how the Vietnam Wall influences people, and the Jefferson Memorial. So, one of my professors at the University of Washington, Barbara Warnick, is doing rhetoric of internet communication. And I'm sure there's lots being done now. I've been out of the loop since '93, so social networking, there has to be a lot of how persuasion proceeds in the social,
I mean, that's
virtual realm.
just because you see this, we're not in an oral age, not in a visual or a written age. But how does it work now?
Yeah.
And that's the most catalyzed.
It's quick.
Cheryl.
You said, I think, that at the end of the age, knowledge would cease. Doesn't it come into its fullness, at least for us, rather than cease?
I was trying to quote the Bible where now we see through a glass darkly, then we will see face to face.
Fully
Now,
known.
now abide faith, hope, and love. And it says love will, or knowledge will cease. And
It's the Phillips tree.
yeah, it's Tallmon butchering the word of God.
Rhetoric will kind of continue on for a while.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Here, Bill, I'll take some. Three more.
Did it work? Did it work? Very good. Very, very good.
So you're doing what you suggested? Oh, good man. Yeah, I had to hear that presentation.
Oh, really? Was it? Oh, okay.
79
You see somebody's recommendation for five.
No.
It's just me that asked the question again.
No, that's fine.
Which service? 282. 282?
Yeah, there are two screens.
9:19, we'll do it together. And the rest of it,
9:19.
Dearest Jesus, among us with your grace, that Satan may not harm us, nor we to sin give place. Abide, O dear Redeemer, among us with your word, and thus now and hereafter to peace and joy afford. Abide with heavenly brightness among us, precious light. Your truth direct and keep us from error's gloomy night. Abide with richest blessings among us, bounteous Lord. Let us in grace and wisdom grow daily through your word. Abide with your protection among us, Lord, our strength. Lest world and Satan foul us and overcome at length. Abide, O faithful Savior, among us with your love. Grant steadfastness and help us to reach our home above.
Page 282, responsive prayer 1, please stand. Holy God, holy and most gracious Father,
Have mercy and hear us. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. I believe in God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, who was conceived by the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried. He descended into hell. The third day he rose again from the dead. He ascended into heaven, and sits at the right hand of God, the Father Almighty. From thence he will come to judge the living and the dead. I believe in the Holy Spirit, the holy Christian Church, the communion of saints, the forgiveness of sins, the resurrection of the body, and the life everlasting. Amen.
Show us your steadfast love, O Lord.
And grant us your salvation.
Let your priests be clothed with righteousness.
And let your saints shout for joy.
Lord, keep this nation under your care.
And guide us in the way of justice and truth.
Let the nations be glad and sing for joy.
For you judge the peoples with equity, and guide the nations upon the earth.
Let the people praise you, O God.
Let all the peoples praise you.
For the needy shall not always be forgotten.
And the hope of the poor shall not perish forever.
Create in me a clean heart, O God.
And renew a right spirit within me.
Hear my prayer, O Lord.
Let my cry come to you.
Let us pray. Lord Jesus, again we are assembled here to remind ourselves of the sacred duty which we have toward the young people growing up in our midst, whom thou hast entrusted to our care. Grant that our darkened understanding be enlightened by thy Spirit, that we may perceive what is right also in this matter. Grant, furthermore, that our will, which by nature is dead and hostile toward thee, and even now is still sluggish in spiritual matters, may by grace and power be awakened, trained, moved, and strengthened, willingly and gladly to do that which thy word tells us is pleasing unto thee. What is, or what a disgrace it would be for us, and how could we face thee on judgment day, if we, to whom thou hast given thy pure unadulterated word, and given it so abundantly, were not willing to act differently from those who still dwell in darkness and in the shadow of death, or to whom at best thy word remains a book sealed with 7 seals. Even now thou wouldst punish us for such unthankfulness by taking the treasure of thy word from us and entrusting it to others. Hereafter we would have to hear thy verdict. I never knew you as mine own. Depart from me, ye that work iniquity. We humbly pray thee not to look upon our past sins, nor to forsake us on their account, but to abide with us, Lord, abide with us, for it is toward evening, and the day is far spent. Hear our prayer for the sake of thy glorious resurrection. Amen. Heavenly Father, in whom we live and move and have our being, we humbly pray you so to guide and govern us by your word and spirit, that in all the cares and occupations of our life, we may not forget you, but remember that we are ever walking in your sight, through Jesus Christ our Lord.
Amen.
Let us bless the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
The Lord bless us, defend us from all evil, and bring us to everlasting life.
Amen.
Thank you. Please be seated. A couple of announcements before you go. You can just leave the hymnals there. We'll be using those again in the morning. The dining hall is in the southeast corner of the quadrant. The quad around here. The drive around the